Hey everybody, in this video I am going to show you the full process for how I painted this cute little scene from a photo I took last summer in Greenwich, England. And I'm going to walk you through step by step my process of making this little sketchbook study. Here's the reference photo I was working from, and this is a photo I took myself last year in Greenwich. You are free to use this photo for your own reference for your artwork. I'll put a link in the description box and I'll talk you through all the steps I took along the way to create my version of this. I will also put in the description box all the colors of paint that I used so you can refer to that, but any colors you have will do. All right, so here we go. And I'm starting with my big areas. So I'm starting with the sky. And the first thing you can see is I dropped in some plain water to create some wet patches to paint into. And now I'm putting a really, really pale wash of raw sienna light along the bottom portion of the sky. This is a little trick I learned from Sherry Blaukoff in her fantastic videos. It adds a lot of warmth to the sky and just gives more interest than a plain flat sky. And raw sienna light will not make green when the cerulean blue I'm using now touches it. It'll make a sort of blue-gray, but it won't make green, so it's a good yellow to warm up our sky. So here you can see just adding a little more color to the top. My easel is tilted so that the wet paint can drip down. And I know some people don't like granulation in the sky, but I do like it, and I very intentionally used cerulean blue, which granulates to make an interesting texture in the sky. Here you see I'm just lifting out a little bit of that wet paint. I want to make sure there's just a wispy cloud vibe happening in the sky. And I'm trying really hard not to play with the paint too much once I put it down, but it is so difficult to resist the temptation. You can see in this video I have sped up the painting process by it's about twice as fast as it took me in real life. So this painting actually took me just under an hour, not counting the drawing. For the foreground here for this dirt path, I have put in a little bit more of that raw sienna light, and then the darker color I touched in was brown ochre to give a little bit of texture. When you are painting, you always want to start with your big shapes. I know it's really tempting to want to get into the little details, but start big and work smaller. So my two biggest obvious shapes were the sky and the foreground path. Now, if you take a look back at the reference photo, you'll see that I have taken some liberties here with the composition. Right now I'm painting in a wall in the background. There definitely was a garden wall. I think it was also covered in vegetation, which I have not attempted to include because it's far in the distance and not an important point. But the major changes I made to the composition are, first of all, I omitted that big, ugly, modern building that is directly behind this little cottage. And I also, I made the orientation of my sketch vertical instead of horizontal because I wanted there to be more sky. I didn't want the chimney, the top of the chimney to be so close to the edge of my sketch as it was in the actual photo. So now that I have my big obvious shapes in, I'm getting into things that are smaller and more detailed. And you can see that as I lay down the green for the vegetation, I'm leaving a lot of white gaps. And so I'm leaving that white space. Some of the white space will remain in the final sketch, and some of it will be turned into flowers. And also, I'm trying to vary cool and warm. So under that tree along the wall in the background, I used a cool green. Coming closer to me, I used a warm green. And now here you can see all the way in the very foreground, I have a cool green again. Alternating cool and warm colors like that is an instant way to add depth to a scene. So it's a little bit of a visual trick. It also just adds a lot more interest and variety. You don't want to have just one flat green covering a whole large area. I do also want to mention that in addition to speeding up this footage, I have cut out places where I'm like washing my brush or mixing colors for a long time. So it might be a little deceptive how quickly I'm going. It's not a time lapse, but it is sped up, and I have cut out the bits where you won't be seeing anything happening. So if you are planning to paint along, I definitely recommend just watch the video all the way through first, get your stuff ready, and don't be afraid to pause the video as needed because although I'm showing you every step along the way, it is definitely not real time. So now to paint in the tree in the background, I'm using a dry brush technique. So I've loaded my brush, but kind of dabbed it off so I get those rough edges. And you can see I'm holding the brush loosely and using the belly of the brush, just kind of like rubbing it onto the page to get irregular edges and give a sort of leafy feel to my tree. And I've also made that tree fairly dark and fairly cool. Um, I feel like that's how it looks in the reference, that it's a pretty dark shape in the background. Compositionally, I thought the tree was important to be sort of somehow balancing out that tall chimney sticking up there. I think that makes an interesting shape across the page. Now that I have a lot of the foreground and background elements basically in place, I'm getting to work on the cottage itself. And on the cottage, all the shapes are small, so um, I have to slow down and be really deliberate. But I also want to point out that I'm still using the same large round brush. So far for this painting, I have used only one brush the whole time. It is a black velvet silver brush. I know that sounds contradictory. It's a silver brush is the brand, and the line is black velvet. And it's a large round brush. It holds tons of water and pigment, but also it makes a really fine point, and I can use it in lots of different ways, so I don't have to keep changing brushes. I tend to, whatever brush I start with, I use for a really long time throughout the painting, and I only change when I absolutely have to. So I try to always start big because otherwise I could start with a small brush and be struggling to cover large areas for no reason. So always start big. It also keeps you looser when you're painting. Now, when it came time to do the panes of glass and the little windows, I decided to start with a trick that I learned from one of Stephanie Bauer's classes. And that was all the windows are really dark the way the light was at this time of day. They're not picking up any sky color and they're looking very dark in the reference. And they're so little and fiddly. And I don't want to go over the white areas. I don't want to have to cover them with gouache or with a gel pen. So I've picked my pencil back up and I am coloring in the panes with graphite just really quickly. This is going to give them a dark uniform shape. You really want the panes of glass to be colored in from edge to edge without any funny shapes. Even though I'm going to go over these with some dark watercolor, um, if I go over them with watercolor and I don't fill in the lines perfectly, they'll still look sensibly like panes of glass because I'm shading in those shapes fairly carefully here with my pencil. I'm also, as you can tell in this video, I'm trying out a new camera angle here. I have my camera to the side of my sketchbook. This is a more comfortable position for me to paint in than having it on a tripod balanced over me where I keep bumping my head on it or getting my head in the shot. And also, I think In this orientation, it's kind of nice that you can see exactly what my brush is doing and my hand isn't covering up the painting the way it is if I put the camera up top. But let me know down in the comments if you like this camera angle or if it's annoying because it is a little bit weird to look from the side. I don't know. Let me know what you think about this camera angle and if you'd like me to keep using it or if I should try something different next time. The dark shade that you saw me painting in there to cover up the window panes, that was a mix of ultramarine, burnt sienna, and a tiny bit of alizarin crimson. And this makes a really great dark color. You can see I'm using that same blend to darken the background wall because I thought it was too light. Although, spoiler alert, later on I'm going to change my mind about that and decide I went and made it too dark, but that's okay. I can always adjust things little by little. But this is a great dark if you're looking to put in deep shadows or something black, but you don't want to use black paint. You've probably heard other watercolorists tell you they never use black paint. I don't have any black paint on my palette. I don't have any black pigment because it can just create too much of like a dead zone in your painting. But when you mix darks yourself, you get something a lot more lively and interesting. For the chimney, I used some more dry brush technique to just get a little texture on there and a little bit of color. It's a kind of gray color. But at this point, for all my darks and shadows, I'm using that mix of ultramarine, burnt sienna, and tiny drops of alizarin crimson. It's such a versatile classic watercolor mix. If you haven't tried it out in your own paintings, I definitely recommend it. It's one of those time-honored mixes that it seems like all the old masters knew and used for good reason. So now you can see, aside from that white area in the foreground where I'm going to put the lavender plants, I've really got all the main pieces in place. And now I'm going to spend quite a lot of time on small details. So the black lines I just put in are the gutters that come down this building. I would say in retrospect, I wouldn't bother with those gutters again. They're maybe a little distracting. Um, that's okay. This is just a sketchbook study, live and learn. And if I decided to make an actual painting of this, I would either put the gutters in using a fine liner for a little more control, or I just probably wouldn't put them in at all. Here's another great thing about mixing your own darks. The initial door was pretty dark on purpose, but I wanted it to have a little details in it, and because I'm using transparent watercolor, even when I laid the pigment in pretty dark, I could still add another layer on top and get some more depth in there. Okay, and now having painted in the tree trunk and a little suggestion of branches, I feel like this painting is really starting to come together, and I'm I'm feeling pretty happy about the level of structure, but also some looseness. I tend to get pretty tight when I'm painting, and so I was trying to keep it loose here and not worry about getting every single detail perfect, but just get the feeling to come through. And I think so far it's going pretty okay. For the shadows on the building, I used the same mix of French ultramarine, burnt sienna, and a little bit of alizarin. And when I laid them in at first like this, they looked a little flat to me. They didn't quite pop. So I came back and the paint was still quite wet. I touched in some ultramarine and just let that blend in to just brighten up my shadows. And finally, it was time to get in here and do the lavender. And I was excited to paint this, but a little nervous because I want to keep it really loose. So the mixture I'm using is cerulean blue and quinacridone rose. And I picked those colors because they make a beautiful purple, but also they will granulate And as I'm touching in water here, you can see the two pigments are separating, they're creating texture and a sort of some luminosity and glow. I also, I did test this on scrap paper before I hopped in here to the actual painting. And now I'm touching in some sap green for the green part of the lavender. And I knew that when that blended with the purple that I had put down, it wasn't going to make an ugly brown. So that's worth testing. But I had used my scrap paper to make sure that was going to look all right. And here I'm just dropping in a little bit more pigment. I really enjoy painting these kind of clumps and clusters of flowers. It took me a long time to give up control and wanting to paint every petal and every leaf and every stem and be able to see them as a large mass like this. So if you're still in the beginning phases of your art journey and you're finding that you see a field of flowers and it's kind of overwhelming, don't worry. That's a normal part of the process. Um, just remember that you're not really painting a flower, you're painting a shape, you're painting a color pattern, and see if you can start to paint them as a group. You can always add more detail later. You can use negative painting to carve out shapes. You can see here, like I'm adding shadows to the bottom of the greenery just to give a sense of depth and that the light is hitting the top. All of that is going to give the impression of a really lush garden without me trying to paint every single flower that I see. This last bit where I get to add in all the tiny details is really fun. I love mark making. I love doing those little bits. Like here, I'm using some white gouache to add the impression of little white flowers in the distance. Um, this gouache I was using was Daniel Smith Titanium White. I tried not to dilute it very much so that it will show up on here. And when I'm looking at my painting now, I'm seeing I really just need some foreground detail to bring everything together. I think in the reference photo, the dark flowers in the lower right-hand corner were actually dead flowers, but they don't need to be dead flowers here in my rendition. So I've painted them in a dark color, and I think the pieces are coming together a little bit here. Now, I mentioned before that ultimately I decided the background wall was too dark, and so you can see here I am using a tiny piece of magic eraser like you might use to clean your kitchen or bathroom, and I'm really gently lifting out some of that dark paint. I'm trying really hard not to smudge it into the white building. It's a really tiny space. I've zoomed the video in here so you can kind of see the effect and what I'm doing. Fortunately, the colors I was using do lift. They don't stain the paper. I mean, they stain it a little, but it's possible to lift them. And here I'm using a brush called an eradicator. It's got these short, really stiff, sturdy bristles, and it basically is just scrubbing at that to lift out what I didn't want. I think if I were going to make a finished painting of this, instead of a wall in the background, I might put a row of trees and just let there be greenery in the background instead of that dark wall. The wall is maybe a little distracting, but for the purposes of exploring in my sketchbook study, I think it's come out pretty okay. On that far side where it was really bothering me, you can see right now I'm just dabbing in some more green, basically making it look like there's maybe some vines going up that wall to just, I don't know, tone it down. And finally, getting into giving a little bit more definition in the foreground. Obviously, we see things closer to us with much more detail than things further away. And I want to give the impression that this purple plant is in fact lavender. So I'm using the same color combination from before, just varying sometimes a little more blue or sometimes a little more pink, and just putting in that vertical movement that lavender is known for. And as I get further away from me into that middle distance, I do less and less so that we have a sense of the distance kind of becoming blurry. I think if I had done the first pass on the lavender a little bit lighter, that would be better. But I do like the overall impression, and I love that color and the textures that come through from the watercolor just doing its thing and doing what watercolor does. It's one of the things I love about watercolor that I've never been able to capture with any other medium, just letting the paint melt together on the page and separate and combine and do all kinds of things that I could not intentionally cause to happen. And honestly, I could spend forever fiddling with little details in a painting. One of the hardest things is knowing when to stop and not overworking it. For this painting, I was really trying to imagine how this would go if I were doing an urban sketch where I'm sitting on location and I'm doing this whole thing from start to finish in one sitting, and I don't have time to fiddle with every little detail. A typical urban sketch takes me about an hour and a half to 2 hours. So for the today's sketch, the drawing took me about a half hour, and the painting in real time about an hour. Once the all the paint was perfectly dry, I got out my trusty fine liner to put the little fence posts of this railing back in. And you can see I'm allowing the line to be broken to give the impression that the foliage of the plants is coming sort of around and through those posts. To be honest, I probably could have gone a little more slowly. My pencil lines for the original fence had mostly disappeared, so the angle might not be quite right. But I did feel like that railing was a pretty important piece of the design and worth including. The way that the light was hitting it in the reference, the top of the rails was white. It was getting a lot of reflected light. So I used my trusty white gel pen to bring back a little bit of that light to the top. I watch loads of people's videos where they use these gel pens and they get these amazing bright white lines. I don't know what they're doing because I cannot accomplish that. But that's pretty much the end. All that's left to do is sign it and take a look at our finished product. So here it is. I did paint my swatches out so I remember what colors I used here. And there's our reference photo. So you can see obviously a fair amount of creative license here, but I created a little cottage that feels inviting and like a lovely summer day in the garden, and I hope that you enjoyed. If you decide to give this scene a try and you share it on social media, please tag me so I can see what you've done. And if you have any thoughts, comments, or questions, pop them in the comments below. I do read comments and respond to them. So if there is stuff you'd like to hear about, just let me know and I'll do my best to fill you in. Thanks so much for your support, and I'll see you again soon.